The restaurant hummed with the usual din of lunchtime conversations, clinking cutlery, and the sizzling of food from the open kitchen. Tom Jenkins, a man well into his 70s, sat at a small table by the window, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to understand what had just been said. Across from him sat his 10-year-old granddaughter, Lily, her eyes wide with confusion. "Sir, I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave. You didn't pay for your last meal here," said Mr. Jenkins, the owner of the restaurant, his voice laced with accusation. Gasps rippled through the crowd of diners, and all eyes turned to the elderly man, their faces frozen in expressions of judgment. Tom's heart raced, his mind reeling. He had always been careful, always paid his bills. This couldn't be happening. I don't understand," Tom stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of the public humiliation. "I've never done such a thing." But the owner was unmoved, waving over a security guard who now loomed over Tom, ready to escort him out. Lily's small hand gripped her grandpa's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Grandpa, what's happening? Why are they saying this?" Tom didn't have an answer. His cheeks burned with shame as he looked around the room, hoping someone might speak up on his behalf. But the restaurant had turned cold, the warmth of the bustling afternoon shattered by the accusation. Tom Jenkins had lived in this small town for most of his life, a place where everyone knew each other and news traveled fast. He was a widower, his wife having passed away nearly a decade ago. Since then, his world had shrunk to the simple comforts of routine. He found solace in his granddaughter, Lily, who came over after school most days to keep him company. Despite his old age, Tom was still spree, often seen around town helping neighbors with odd jobs, tending to his modest garden, or visiting the local library. He was well-liked, the kind of man who smiled at strangers and offered kind words to anyone who needed them. But today was different. Today, everything felt wrong. It was a Saturday morning, the kind Tom usually looked forward to. He had promised Lily they would go out for lunch, a treat they shared on the weekends. They had a favorite spot, a cozy family-owned restaurant that served the best homemade meals in town. It was a place where Tom felt comfortable, like he belonged. The owner, Mr. Jenkins, no relation, had always been friendly, even if a bit strict about business. Tom had never imagined anything could go wrong in such a familiar setting. Lily was the light of Tom's life. With her bright smile and curious eyes, she reminded him of his late wife, and he took great pride in their bond. They had their little rituals: Sunday walks in the park, afternoon chess games, and Saturday lunches at this very restaurant. He treasured these moments, knowing that Lily was growing up fast. Tom often told Lily stories from his youth, trying to pass down lessons he'd learned over his many years. He had lived a quiet life, content with the small pleasures of family, friends, and his community. He wasn't rich, but he had enough, and that was all that mattered. As they sat at their usual table by the window, watching the townspeople go about their day, Tom felt a sense of peace. The sun streamed in, casting a warm glow over the room. He and Lily chatted about her school, her friends, and the art project she was excited to show him later. Everything felt normal, until the accusation came crashing down on him like a sudden storm. The restaurant was unusually busy that day, filled with families, couples, and groups of friends enjoying their weekend meals. Waiters darted between tables, balancing trays of steaming dishes, while the clatter of plates and the low hum of conversations created a familiar backdrop of activity. Tom and Lily had found their usual spot, a cozy corner table near the window. The view overlooked the town's main street, where local shops were buzzing with activity. Tom had ordered their favorite meal, grilled chicken and mashed potatoes for himself, and Lily's beloved mac and cheese. It was a simple but perfect lunch, one they had shared countless times before. As they waited for their food, Tom took a moment to appreciate the scene. The light was soft, the air filled with the smell of home-cooked meals, and for a while, everything felt right. He glanced at Lily, her small face lit with excitement as she talked about her new school project. Tom smiled, his heart swelling with love for his granddaughter. But just as their food arrived, Mr. Jenkins, the owner, appeared at their table, his face grim. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, his voice low but firm, "we need to have a word." Tom looked up, puzzled, as the rest of the restaurant seemed to fall into an uneasy silence. Mr. Jenkins stood with his arms crossed, a frown creasing his forehead. "Sir, I've reviewed our security footage from last week. It shows you leaving without paying for your meal." Tom blinked in confusion. What? That can't be right. I always pay my bill." The accusation felt like a punch to the gut. Tom's voice trembled, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he tried to process what was happening. Lily, sensing the tension, looked up at her grandfather with wide, worried eyes. "Are you sure?" Tom asked, his voice barely audible. "There must be some mistake." But Mr. Jenkins shook his head. "I'm sorry, Tom, but the footage is clear. I don't want to make a scene, but if you don't pay now for the meal you skipped, I'll have to ask you to leave." A murmur rippled through the restaurant. People were watching, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in front of them. Tom felt their judgment pressing down on him like a weight. His throat tightened, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I don't understand," he repeated, his voice cracking. "I've been coming here for years. I've never skipped a bill." Mr. Jenkins sighed. "I know, Tom, and that's why this is so hard. But I can't ignore what the cameras show. Either you pay now, or you'll have to leave." Tom fumbled in his pockets for his wallet, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grasp it. Lily reached out and held his arm, her face pale with fear. "Grandpa, it's okay," she whispered, though her voice quivered. "We'll figure it out." But Tom could barely hear her. The shame was overwhelming, and all he could think about was how everyone in the restaurant must see him as a thief, as someone who couldn't be trusted. Tom's mind raced. He was a man of integrity, someone who had built a lifetime of trust and respect in this town. How could things have gone so wrong, so fast? He knew he had paid for every meal he'd ever had at this restaurant. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding. But in this moment, no one was listening. The evidence, however faulty, was stacked against him. As the security guard approached, Tom felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. This couldn't be happening. He looked down at Lily, her innocent eyes filled with worry, and he wanted to protect her from the ugly truth of the world. But how could he, when he couldn't even protect himself from the humiliation he was now enduring? The restaurant buzzed with whispers, and Tom could feel the eyes of the other patrons boring into him. He had never felt so alone. As Tom sat frozen in his seat, waiting for what would come next, a small voice cut through the noise. "Wait," said a voice from behind. It was Susan, one of the waitresses who had been serving them for years. "Let me take a look at that footage." Her words hung in the air like a lifeline, offering Tom a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. Could it be that this nightmare wasn't as cut and dry as it seemed? Tom looked up, his heart pounding, as the entire restaurant held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as Tom Jenkins sat frozen at his table, his mind struggling to catch up with the gravity of the situation. His eyes darted around the room, seeking a familiar face, someone who might come to his defense. But no one moved. At that moment, Susan, the head waitress, walked out from behind the counter. She had seen the commotion building from the back of the restaurant, her sharp eyes catching the shift in the room's energy long before she heard the owner's voice. Susan was known for her efficiency and no-nonsense attitude. She had worked at the restaurant for over a decade, and while she wasn't one to meddle in other people's business, she had a keen sense of fairness. She knew the regulars, their habits, and their characters, and Tom was one of the most familiar faces. He was always polite, tipping generously even though he lived modestly. The accusation didn't sit right with her. "Is everything okay here?" Susan asked, her voice calm but firm as she approached the table. Tom looked up, his face pale, lips trembling. I don't understand," he stammered. "I've never skipped a bill. There must be a mistake." Susan turned to Mr. Jenkins, the restaurant's owner, who was standing rigidly with his arms crossed. His face was set in stone, his expression one of authority and finality. "Mr. Jenkins," Susan said, addressing her boss with the respect she had always shown him, "what's going on?" Mr. Jenkins didn't budge from his stance, his eyes locked on Tom. "We've had an incident," he said coldly. "I reviewed the security footage from last week, and it shows Mr. Jenkins here leaving without paying for his meal. It's not something I take lightly. Theft is theft." The word stung Tom like a sharp slap across the face. His breath caught in his throat, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Layli, sitting across from him, looked up with wide eyes, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding in front of her. Her small hands clutched the edge of the table, as if she could hold on to something stable in the confusion. "There's no way," Tom protested, his voice a weak whisper in the cacophony of murmurs that now filled the restaurant. "I always pay." Mr. Jenkins ignored him, pulling out a tablet from under his arm. He tapped a few buttons, and soon the screen lit up with grainy footage from the restaurant's security camera. The video showed an elderly man, hunched slightly like Tom, standing up from the table, putting on his coat, and walking out of the door. There was no sign of him paying at the register, no interaction with the staff. It was a damning piece of evidence, and the crowd of patrons watched in silence. The weight of the situation pressed down on Tom like an unbearable burden. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the footage. How could this have happened? He had no memory of walking out without paying. In fact, he distinctly remembered pulling out his wallet, counting the bills carefully, and leaving the money on the table. But the evidence was there, undeniable, playing out in front of everyone. The footage, though blurry, showed someone who looked remarkably like him. The accusations, the stares, the whispers, it was too much. Tom felt his hands shake, his dignity crumbling in the face of public shame. "Grandpa, did you do something wrong?" Lily's voice was soft and uncertain. She was too young to fully grasp the seriousness of the accusation, but the look of hurt and confusion on her face cut deeper than any words. Tom swallowed hard, unable to find the right thing to say. He had always been the strong one, the protector, the one Lily could rely on. But now, here he was, a frail old man, accused of being something he was not. "Of course not, Lily," Tom said, though his voice trembled. "There's been a mistake. I would never do such a thing." But his assurances seemed weak against the backdrop of the video playing on the screen. Around them, the restaurant patrons had split into two camps. Some of the regulars who had known Tom for years were murmuring to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. How could a man like Tom Jenkins, who had lived in the town all his life and built a reputation as an honest, hard-working citizen, be guilty of theft? Others, though, weren't so sure. The footage, blurry as it was, seemed to show something undeniable. "He's always been a nice guy," one man whispered to his wife at the next table. "But you never know what people are capable of when they're desperate." The woman next to him frowned. "I can't believe Tom would do something like this. He's always been so kind. There has to be a mistake." But as Mr. Jenkins replayed the footage, more people began to murmur their doubts. The evidence was there, right on the screen, and it was hard to argue with what they were seeing. "I don't know," another patron said quietly, eyeing Tom suspiciously. "It looks pretty clear to me. He didn't pay." The room was buzzing with tension, the atmosphere thick with judgment. The regulars who had once greeted Tom with smiles and nods were now either looking at him with suspicion or avoiding his gaze entirely. It was as if the entire restaurant had turned against him in an instant. Susan, watching the scene unfold, felt her heart sink. She knew Tom. She had served him dozens of times, seen him with his granddaughter, chatted with him about the weather and town news. There was something wrong here, but with the footage as damning as it was, she couldn't quite figure out what was going on. Mr. Jenkins, sensing the crowd was leaning in his favor, crossed his arms and looked down at Tom with an air of finality. "I'm sorry, Tom, but I can't ignore this. The footage is clear. You walked out without paying." "I would never," Tom whispered, but his words seemed to evaporate in the air before they reached anyone's ears. Susan stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. "Mr. Jenkins, are you sure this is the right footage? It's kind of blurry, and Tom's always paid his bills before. Maybe we should double-check." Mr. Jenkins shot her a look. "Susan, the footage doesn't lie. And besides, I've had issues with payments before. He's not the only one. People take advantage when you're running a small business." Susan bit her lip, thinking. She glanced at Tom, who sat hunched over, his shoulders shaking with quiet shame. Lily was holding his hand now, her small fingers gripping his, as if she could somehow protect him from what was happening. The whole scene made Susan's stomach turn. "I'm not saying we shouldn't take it seriously," Susan continued, trying to choose her words carefully. "But maybe we should look at the footage from a different angle. Maybe there's another explanation." Mr. Jenkins' face hardened. "And maybe there isn't. Either he pays up now, or he's out." Tom's hands trembled as he reached for his wallet, but Susan quickly stepped in. "Wait," she said, her voice more forceful now. "I've worked here long enough to know Tom wouldn't do this. Something's not adding up." The tension in the room grew thicker with every passing moment. The crowd was torn. Some of the older patrons nodded in agreement with Susan. Tom had been a fixture in the community for so long, and it was hard to believe he would ever intentionally do something so dishonest. "He's a good man," said one of the elderly women at a nearby table, her voice shaky but clear. "There must be a mistake. I've known Tom for decades." But others weren't so sure. "People fall on hard times," said a man standing by the bar. "Maybe he just didn't have the money. It's not easy being old and broke." Tom felt the eyes of the room bore into him from all sides. Every whisper, every judgment, cut through him like a blade. He had always been proud of his integrity, his standing in the community. Now, all of that was unraveling before his eyes. Susan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She couldn't let this end like this. There had to be more to the story. Taking a deep breath, Susan turned to Mr. Jenkins, her voice firm. "Let me check the footage from the other cameras. We have more angles, right?" Mr. Jenkins hesitated, clearly frustrated by the delay. "Susan, this is a waste of time. We saw what happened." "Please," Susan insisted. "If we're going to accuse him of something this serious, we need to be absolutely sure." Mr. Jenkins, though reluctant, finally sighed and nodded. "Fine. Check the footage. But I'm telling you, it's not going to change anything." With that, Susan hurried to the back room, her heart racing. She knew something wasn't right. As she pulled up the footage from the other angles, her fingers trembled slightly. She just hoped she would find the proof that would clear Tom's name. The tension in the restaurant hung thick in the air, a palpable force that weighed on everyone in the room. Tom Jenkins sat silently at his table, his head lowered in shame, his trembling hands still resting on the edge of the table. Lily sat beside him, her small face pale with fear and confusion. Across the room, Mr. Jenkins, the restaurant's owner, stood with his arms crossed, his expression resolute. The grainy security footage still played on the tablet in front of him, damning Tom in the eyes of the restaurant patrons who had all but decided his guilt. The security guard stood nearby, waiting for the word to escort Tom out, while the room buzzed with hushed conversations and judgmental glances. Susan, the head waitress, stood just behind Mr. Jenkins, watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease. She had worked here for over a decade, long enough to know most of the regulars, their quirks and their habits, and she knew Tom Jenkins. He wasn't the kind of man who would walk out on a bill. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. But Susan also knew her boss. Mr. Jenkins was a proud man, a hard-nosed businessman who didn't tolerate mistakes, especially not from his staff. He had built this restaurant from the ground up, and it was his pride and joy. To question him, especially in front of customers, was a dangerous move. Susan stood still, torn between her loyalty to the restaurant and her growing suspicion that something wasn't right. Her mind raced as she replayed the events in her head. The way Tom had looked so confused, the fear in Lily's eyes, the way the restaurant had turned against a man they had known for years in an instant. It all felt so wrong. As Mr. Jenkins gestured for the security guard to step forward, Susan felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Tom was about to be humiliated, thrown out of the restaurant in front of everyone. And once that happened, there would be no coming back from it. His reputation in the town would be destroyed. The shame would follow him wherever he went. "Susan, go back to work," Mr. Jenkins said, his tone dismissive, as he prepared to finalize the scene. But Susan couldn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, her mind whirling. She could stay silent, go back to her station, and let this all unfold without getting involved. After all, it wasn't her responsibility. Tom wasn't her family. And confronting Mr. Jenkins in front of customers could cost her everything: her job, her reputation, the life she had built here. Or she could do what her conscience was screaming at her to do: stand up for Tom. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as she made her decision. Finally, Susan took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Wait," she said, her voice loud enough to cut through the noise of the restaurant. All eyes turned toward her, including Mr. Jenkins, who shot her a look of disbelief and annoyance. "We can't throw Tom out like this." The room fell silent. The patrons, who had been murmuring among themselves, stopped to watch the confrontation unfold. Tom lifted his head, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and confusion. Lily's grip on her grandpa's arm tightened, her small face turning toward Susan with a flicker of relief. "What are you doing?" Mr. Jenkins asked, his voice low but menacing. "This isn't your business, Susan. Go back to work." But Susan stood her ground. "I've worked here for years, Mr. Jenkins, and I'd never seen anything like this. Tom's a regular. He's never missed a bill. This doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense," Mr. Jenkins snapped, holding up the tablet with the security footage. "The proof is right here. He walked out without paying." Susan hesitated, her heart pounding. She knew this was the moment that would change everything. She could back down now, save herself the trouble, and let things unfold as they were. Or she could push forward, risk everything, and demand justice for Tom. Taking another deep breath, Susan made her choice. "I've noticed some strange things in the books lately," she said, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger as she continued. "There have been discrepancies in the receipts and cash flow. I thought it might have been a mistake, but now I'm starting to wonder if something else is going on." The room erupted into whispers as patrons exchanged surprised glances. Mr. Jenkins' face turned red with anger, his eyes narrowing on Susan. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "I'm saying that something doesn't add up," Susan continued, her voice steady now. "I've seen customers confused about their bills before, and I've noticed inconsistencies when we count the register at the end of the night. And now this. Tom being accused of something I know he didn't do. We need to look at this more closely before we make any decisions." Mr. Jenkins looked like he was about to explode. "Are you accusing me of mishandling my own restaurant?" he growled. "I'm not accusing anyone," Susan said quickly, though her heart was racing. "I'm just saying we should take a closer look at the footage, and maybe at the records from that day. If there's a mistake, we'll find it." The tension in the room was almost unbearable now. Tom sat silently, staring at Susan with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Lily clung to his arm, her eyes wide with hope. Mr. Jenkins hesitated, his face a mask of fury. He was clearly torn between dismissing Susan outright and the realization that the eyes of the entire restaurant were on him. He couldn't afford to lose face in front of his customers, but neither could he allow his authority to be challenged in public. The patrons were watching, waiting for his next move. Some of them had started to murmur in agreement with Susan, while others remained skeptical. The restaurant staff, too, had stopped in their tracks, their eyes darting between Susan and Mr. Jenkins, wondering what would happen next. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Jenkins finally spoke. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But if this turns out to be a waste of time, there will be consequences, Susan. For you." Susan nodded, her heart pounding. She knew the risk she was taking, but she also knew she couldn't back down now. Susan quickly moved to the back office, where the security system's servers were located. She knew the restaurant had multiple cameras set up, and the footage from the other angles might show something that had been missed in the first video. Her hands trembled slightly as she navigated through the system, pulling up footage from different cameras around the restaurant. As the videos loaded, Susan's breath caught in her throat. The angle from the main dining area showed Tom clearly standing up from his table, putting on his coat, and walking toward the door. But something in the corner of the screen caught her eye. Another man, sitting at a table near the exit, standing up at almost the exact same time. The man was dressed similarly to Tom, with a dark coat and hat, and from the grainy footage, it was easy to see how they could have been confused. But this man didn't walk out the front door. Instead, he lingered near the register, speaking to one of the waitstaff, before slipping out quietly without paying. Susan's heart raced as she realized what had happened. The footage had been misinterpreted. The man who had skipped the bill wasn't Tom. It was the other man who had left just after him. Tom, it seemed, had left his payment on the table, just as he always did. With this new evidence in hand, Susan hurried back to the dining area, where the tension was still thick in the air. Mr. Jenkins was standing at the front of the restaurant, arms crossed, while Tom sat silently, his head still bowed in shame. "I've reviewed the footage," Susan said, her voice clear and confident now. "There's been a mistake. Tom didn't skip his bill. The real culprit was another man who left just after him." The room fell silent as Susan pulled up the footage on the tablet, showing Mr. Jenkins the proof. The patrons leaned in, watching closely as the video played out. Sure enough, the other man could be seen slipping out without paying, while Tom's payment remained on the table. Mr. Jenkins' face went pale as the realization dawned on him. This can't be," he muttered, but the evidence was undeniable. Susan turned to Tom, her voice softening. "You're free to go, Mr. Jenkins. I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding." Tom slowly lifted his head, his eyes filled with tears of relief. He opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. Instead, he simply nodded, his hand squeezing Lily's as she smiled up at him with a mixture of relief and pride. The patrons, too, began to murmur in surprise and guilt. Some who had whispered against Tom earlier now looked away in shame, while others nodded in agreement with Susan's discovery. As the crowd murmured in surprise and relief, the tension in the room began to ease, but it was clear that the situation was far from over. Mr. Jenkins stood frozen, his face pale as the realization set in that he had wrongly accused one of his most loyal customers. The weight of his mistake hung heavily in the air, while Tom sat quietly, still processing what had just happened. His granddaughter, Lily, remained at his side, her small hand gripping his, sensing the complexity of the moment even if she didn't fully understand it. Susan had brought the truth to light, but now there was more to uncover. As the restaurant began to settle back into a fragile calm, Susan felt a gnawing sensation in her gut. Something still didn't add up. The man who had slipped out without paying. He looked too familiar, like more than just a random customer. Susan's mind raced as she replayed the footage in her head. The man who had left without paying was not just a random diner. He was Paul, a former employee who had left the restaurant under less than ideal circumstances. A few months back, Paul had been fired for suspicious behavior, including mishandling money at the register. It hadn't seemed serious enough to call the police at the time, but it was enough for Mr. Jenkins to let him go. Now, watching the footage again, Susan realized Paul had been framing customers like Tom all along. It wasn't a one-time incident. It was a pattern. He had likely been slipping out unnoticed, taking advantage of the chaos in the restaurant and leaving innocent customers to take the blame for his thefts. And this time, Tom had been the unfortunate target. Susan felt her heart race as she pieced it all together. This was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. Paul had been manipulating the system for months, and she had ignored the signs. For weeks, Susan had noticed small discrepancies in the restaurant's bookkeeping. Tips that didn't match, bills that seemed off by a few dollars, and the occasional customer complaint that their card hadn't been charged properly. She had brushed it off as mistakes or technical glitches, not wanting to stir the pot with Mr. Jenkins. She had seen how harsh he could be when things went wrong, and she hadn't wanted to risk her job over something she couldn't definitively prove. But now, seeing the pattern clearly, Susan realized she had ignored her instincts for too long. Her silence had allowed Paul to continue his scheme, and today it had almost cost Tom Jenkins his reputation. Susan felt a pang of guilt wash over her. If she had spoken up earlier, perhaps this entire ordeal could have been avoided. But she knew there was no time for self-pity. She needed to confront Mr. Jenkins and reveal the full truth before anything else went wrong. Taking a deep breath, Susan walked up to Mr. Jenkins, who was still staring at the tablet in disbelief. "There's more to this," she said, her voice firm but steady. Mr. Jenkins looked up, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. "What do you mean?" Susan glanced at the patrons, who were still lingering in the aftermath of the confrontation, before lowering her voice. "The man in the footage, the one who really skipped the bill, is Paul. You remember him, right?" Mr. Jenkins frowned, trying to place the name. "Paul. The guy we fired a few months ago." "Yes," Susan said, nodding. "He's been framing customers. I'm sure of it. Remember all those discrepancies we had with the register, the missing tips and the confused customers? It wasn't just a coincidence. Paul's been coming back, sneaking into the restaurant, and leaving without paying. He's using customers like Tom to cover for him." Mr. Jenkins' eyes widened as the full weight of the situation began to sink in. "Are you telling me this has been going on for months?" Susan nodded again, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she could have stopped this sooner. "I've noticed things for a while, but I didn't want to bring it up because I wasn't sure. I didn't want to cause trouble without proof. But now, after seeing the footage, I'm certain. Paul's been stealing from the restaurant and leaving customers to take the blame." The realization hit Mr. Jenkins hard. He stood there, silent for a moment, his face a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and regret. He had been so quick to accuse Tom, so sure of his authority, that he hadn't even considered the possibility of being wrong. Now, not only had he nearly destroyed an innocent man's reputation, but he had also allowed a former employee to continue exploiting his business. The weight of the truth settled over the room as Susan's words sank in. Mr. Jenkins, his face flushed with shame, turned toward Tom, who was still sitting quietly, his head bowed in exhaustion and humiliation. The other patrons had fallen silent, their earlier whispers of judgment replaced with a deep sense of unease. "Tom," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice soft but clear, I owe you a huge apology. I was wrong. You didn't do anything wrong, and I should never have accused you like that. I'm so sorry." Tom looked up slowly, his eyes tired but filled with quiet dignity. For a moment, he didn't speak, the emotions of the past hour swirling inside him. Finally, he gave a small nod, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Lily, who had been watching everything unfold, looked up at her grandfather with relief in her eyes. "See, Grandpa, I knew you didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, squeezing his hand. But though Tom was exonerated, the damage had been done. The public humiliation he had endured couldn't be undone with a simple apology, and the people who had been so quick to judge him now found themselves feeling the weight of their own guilt. As Tom and Lily stood to leave, a ripple of uncomfortable silence passed through the restaurant. The patrons who had been so quick to assume the worst were now grappling with their own actions. Why had they been so quick to believe that Tom, a man they had known and respected for years, was guilty of such a crime. Why had they allowed the evidence of a blurry video to override what they knew about his character? An elderly woman sitting near the window spoke softly to her husband. "I feel awful. We've known Tom for so long. How could we have doubted him?" Her husband shook his head. "We were all too quick to judge. It's a lesson for all of us." Another man, who had been vocal about Tom's supposed guilt, looked down at his plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "I don't know why I jumped to conclusions," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I should have known better." The realization began to spread through the room. They had been too eager to cast judgment, too willing to accept the worst without considering the person standing in front of them. It was a sobering moment for everyone. For Tom, though, the relief of being proven innocent was tempered by the deep hurt of what had happened. He had lived in this town for his entire life, built relationships, and earned the respect of the community. Yet, in a single afternoon, all of that had been shattered. The people who had smiled at him on the street, who had shaken his hand at community events, had turned on him without hesitation. As he and Lily walked toward the door, heads turned away, unable to meet his gaze. Some of the patrons looked as though they wanted to apologize, but the words caught in their throats, their shame too heavy to allow them to speak. Lily looked up at her grandfather, her young mind still processing the day's events. "Grandpa," she asked softly, "why did they think you did something bad?" Tom paused, his heart aching as he searched for an answer that would make sense to her. "Sometimes people are afraid to think for themselves," he said gently. "They see something that seems bad, and instead of asking questions, they believe it right away." "But you didn't do anything wrong," Lily said, her voice firm with conviction. "I know," Tom replied, giving her a small smile. "And that's what matters." Mr. Jenkins, still standing by the counter, watched as Tom and Lily made their way out of the restaurant. His heart was heavy with guilt, and he knew that his apology, though sincere, wasn't enough to undo the damage he had caused. He had been too quick to rely on the footage, too quick to cast blame without thinking about the man in front of him. As the door closed behind Tom, Mr. Jenkins turned to Susan. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for speaking up. I should have listened sooner." Susan nodded but didn't say anything. She knew that while justice had been served today, there was still much to reckon with. The community had to face its own biases, its own readiness to judge without evidence. It was a lesson for all of them, one that would linger long after the restaurant returned to its usual bustle. The events of that fateful day in the restaurant had sent shockwaves through the small town. The revelation that Tom Jenkins, a long-standing member of the community, had been wrongly accused and nearly humiliated in public left many people feeling uneasy. The accusations, the rush to judgment, and the ultimate truth of the situation had sparked conversations in households, on street corners, and even in the town's local coffee shop. For some, the truth brought with it a deep sense of guilt and shame. They had been too quick to believe the worst, too quick to turn their backs on someone they had known and respected for years. Others, however, downplayed their involvement, brushing off their initial reactions as mere misunderstandings or justified caution. The town was now divided, not only over Tom's situation, but over what it said about the community itself. Among those who felt the sting of shame were the regular patrons who had been present in the restaurant that day. They had witnessed the unfolding drama firsthand, some even participating in the quiet whispers of judgment that spread through the room. Now, in the days that followed, they were forced to confront their own actions. "I can't believe I jumped to conclusions like that," said Margaret, an elderly woman who had known Tom since childhood. She sat with her husband at the kitchen table, sipping her tea with a furrowed brow. "I've always known Tom to be an honest man. What was I thinking?" Her husband, Harold, nodded slowly. "We all made mistakes that day, but it was easy to get swept up in it. The footage looked convincing. Still, I should have trusted my gut." Conversations like this echoed through the town. People who had always considered themselves fair and just were now questioning their own biases. They had been too quick to believe what they saw on a screen, too quick to judge without asking questions, and the fact that it had happened to someone as respected as Tom only made their guilt more profound. But not everyone felt the same level of remorse. "I don't see why everyone's making such a big deal out of it," said Steve, a local business owner, over his morning coffee with friends. "Mistakes happen. We thought Tom didn't pay, but it turned out to be someone else. No harm done, right?" His friend, Dave, shook his head. No harm done. The man was nearly thrown out of the restaurant in front of his granddaughter. People treated him like a criminal. "It's not that simple, Steve." Steve shrugged. "People overreact all the time. Tom's fine now, isn't he? It was just a misunderstanding." This dismissive attitude was echoed by others in town, people who were eager to move past the incident without dwelling on the moral implications. But for those who had been closest to Tom, the wound cut deeper. Though Tom had been cleared of all accusations, the emotional scars from that day remained. He found it hard to shake the feeling of betrayal. For years, he had walked the streets of this town with a sense of belonging, a sense that he was part of a larger community. But now, every time he passed someone who had been in the restaurant that day, he couldn't help but wonder what they had thought of him in that moment. He replayed the events over and over in his mind. The accusation, the shocked expressions on the faces of people he had known for decades, the whispers of doubt and suspicion. It was as if, in an instant, all the trust he had built over the years had been swept away, replaced by a tidal wave of judgment. Lily, though young, had sensed her grandfather's sadness. She had been with him during the worst of it. And now, in the days that followed, she had questions. "Grandpa," she asked one evening as they sat together on the porch, "why did everyone think you did something bad when you didn't?" Tom sighed, unsure of how to explain the complexities of human nature to a child. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the fading sunset. "People are quick to believe what they see, Lily," he said softly. "Sometimes they don't stop to ask questions or to understand the whole story. It's easier to believe the worst when you don't take the time to know the truth." "But you didn't do anything wrong," Lily insisted, her young voice full of confusion and frustration. "Why didn't they believe you?" Tom didn't have an easy answer for her. Sometimes people make mistakes. They see something that seems real, and they don't stop to think that it might be wrong. Lily thought for a moment, her brows furrowed. "Will they still think you're a bad person?" Tom's heart ached at the question. "No, sweetie," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "They know the truth now. That's what matters." But deep down, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. Even though the truth had come out, he knew that some of the damage couldn't be undone. For Susan, the head waitress who had risked everything to stand up for Tom, the aftermath of the incident brought its own set of challenges. While she was relieved that she had spoken up and helped clear Tom's name, the consequences of her actions weighed heavily on her. The restaurant, once a bustling hub of the community, had taken a hit in the days following the incident. Some locals had stopped coming, either out of loyalty to Tom or because they were uncomfortable with how Mr. Jenkins had handled the situation. Susan had overheard conversations from regular patrons expressing their disappointment in the way the restaurant had treated an innocent man. "I don't know if I can go back there," one customer had said to another as they passed by the restaurant. "Not after what happened to Tom. It just doesn't feel right." The restaurant's reputation had suffered, and with it, so had Susan's standing within the business. Mr. Jenkins, though grateful that Susan had uncovered the truth, had been visibly frustrated by the fallout. He blamed her, in part, for stirring up the situation and for pushing the investigation further than he thought necessary. "You did the right thing," he had told her one day after the dust had settled. "But we've lost a lot of customers because of this. I'm not sure how we're going to recover." Susan had nodded, understanding his frustration but feeling conflicted. She knew she had done the right thing by speaking up for Tom, but had her actions caused more harm than good? If she had stayed quiet, maybe things would have blown over. The restaurant might not have suffered the way it had, and Tom's reputation might have been salvaged in some other way. The thought gnawed at her. She had always prided herself on being fair and just, but now, in the aftermath, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice. The consequences for the restaurant were undeniable. Business had slowed significantly in the days following the incident. Some locals had stopped coming altogether, while others came less frequently, their trust in the establishment shaken. Mr. Jenkins, who had once been a respected business owner, now found himself dealing with the fallout of his hasty decision. Faced with mounting pressure from the community, Mr. Jenkins had no choice but to issue a public apology. One morning, he called a town meeting at the local community center, where he stood before a room full of familiar faces, many of whom had been there the day Tom was accused. "I want to start by saying how deeply sorry I am," Mr. Jenkins began, his voice heavy with regret. "What happened to Tom Jenkins was wrong, and I take full responsibility for the way I handled the situation. I let my judgment get clouded, and I failed to treat Tom with the respect and fairness he deserved. For that, I am truly sorry." The room was silent as Mr. Jenkins spoke, his words echoing off the walls of the community center. Some nodded in approval, recognizing the sincerity of his apology, while others remained skeptical, their arms crossed, still processing the events that had unfolded. Mr. Jenkins continued, "I know that many of you have lost faith in my restaurant, and I understand why. I can't undo what happened, but I hope to earn back your trust over time. This community means everything to me, and I hope you'll give me the chance to make things right." It was a difficult moment for Mr. Jenkins, but one that was necessary. The public apology helped repair some of the damage. But the road to fully restoring the restaurant's reputation would be long and uncertain. For Susan, the aftermath of the incident had its own set of challenges. Professionally, she had to deal with the fact that her decision to speak up had caused tension within the restaurant. While Mr. Jenkins had ultimately been grateful for her intervention, there was an unspoken rift between them. He was still the boss, and though Susan had been right, the financial toll on the business had left him feeling conflicted about her actions. Her coworkers, too, were divided. Some praised her bravery, while others resented the fact that her actions had brought so much scrutiny to the restaurant. She found herself in an awkward position, navigating the fine line between doing what was right and the personal cost of that decision. The days after the incident at the restaurant were a time of quiet reflection for Tom Jenkins. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least to a version of normal that Tom hadn't expected. He still made his daily walks through town, still spent time with his granddaughter, Lily, but there was a marked change in the way he approached the world. Tom had always been a fixture in the community, friendly, outgoing, someone people could rely on. But after the public accusation, he found himself more cautious, more reserved. The betrayal he felt that day hadn't entirely faded, and it left a scar that was difficult to ignore. Each time he passed by the restaurant, Tom felt a mixture of emotions. He had been cleared of wrongdoing, yes, but the humiliation of being judged by his own community still lingered. People smiled at him in the streets, offered apologies, and tried to make amends. But Tom couldn't forget how quickly they had turned on him, how easily they had believed the worst about a man they had known for decades. His once confident steps now carried a slight hesitation. When he visited the local grocery store or ran errands in town, he noticed people giving him sympathetic looks, and sometimes the whispers still followed him. Though most people had apologized, the incident had cast a shadow over his life, a reminder of how fragile trust could be. Lily, always by his side, seemed to sense the change in her grandfather. She was old enough to understand that something serious had happened, but young enough to believe in the goodness of the people around her. Tom was grateful for her innocence, though he wished he could share in her optimism. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that the world, even in a small town like his, could be unforgiving. Still, as time passed, Tom began to rebuild. Slowly, he allowed himself to reconnect with the community. He volunteered at local events, rejoined his church group, and made an effort to engage with those who had wronged him, hoping to mend the broken bonds. But something fundamental had shifted. He was now more guarded, less willing to extend the same trust he once had so freely given. For Susan, the head waitress, life after the incident was a mixture of personal and professional challenges. She had risked her job, her reputation, and her relationships within the restaurant by standing up for Tom, and the fallout had been significant. On the professional front, things were tough. Business at the restaurant had taken a hit, and there were days when Susan could feel the tension between her and Mr. Jenkins. Though he had apologized for his role in the wrongful accusation, the financial strain on the restaurant had created an unspoken rift between them. Some of her coworkers had resented her for pushing so hard, feeling that she had put the restaurant's reputation at risk. Others, however, quietly admired her courage, even if they didn't say it outright. Despite the challenges, Susan never doubted that she had done the right thing. The memory of Tom's helplessness, sitting there with his granddaughter, being unfairly judged, haunted her. She couldn't have stood by and let it happen. Her conscience was clear, and she found comfort in knowing that she had followed her moral compass, even if it had cost her something. Over time, people in the community began to see Susan differently. Her reputation shifted from being just the waitress to being someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the consequences. Quietly, a new kind of respect began to grow for her. People would nod in acknowledgement when they saw her, some even coming into the restaurant just to thank her for her bravery. Susan, too, was changed by the experience. She had always been practical, focused on doing her job well and keeping out of trouble. But this incident had shown her that sometimes doing the right thing meant stepping out of that comfort zone. She realized that integrity came with a price, but it was one she was willing to pay. As the dust settled, the town began to reflect on what had happened. The rush to judgment, the way everyone had so quickly believed Tom was guilty, left a bitter taste in the mouths of many. Conversations sprung up in town meetings, local clubs, and even around kitchen tables about how the community had failed one of its own. Key figures in the town, including the mayor and the local business association, decided to take action. They recognized that the incident with Tom wasn't just about a single mistake. It was about the underlying issues of how quickly people judge without having all the facts. In a town meeting a few weeks after the event, the mayor proposed new policies for local businesses, including mandatory training for employees on how to handle disputes fairly and respectfully. There was also a push to implement a community watch program, where local residents could volunteer to help mediate situations like the one Tom had endured before they spiraled out of control. "We have to do better," the mayor said at the meeting. "What happened to Tom Jenkins was a wake-up call. We cannot allow our biases and assumptions to dictate how we treat people. We must strive to be fair, to ask questions, and to remember that everyone is innocent until proven otherwise." The town's response was overwhelmingly positive. Many people volunteered for the new programs, and local businesses, including the restaurant, signed up for the training sessions. It was a small step toward healing, but it was a sign that the town was learning from its mistakes. Just as Tom was beginning to heal, a surprising twist emerged that shook the community once again. One afternoon, while Tom was sitting on his porch, a neighbor he had known for years, Sam, approached him. Sam was a quiet man, someone who kept to himself, but today there was a weight on his shoulders that was impossible to ignore. "Tom, can I have a word with you?" Sam asked, his voice hesitant. Tom, though surprised, nodded and gestured for Sam to sit down next to him. "Of course, Sam. What's on your mind?" Sam looked uncomfortable, his hands fidgeting as he gathered his thoughts. I've been thinking about what happened at the restaurant, about the guy who was really stealing. I knew about him." Tom's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "You knew?" Sam sighed deeply. "Yeah, I did. Paul. The guy who was really behind it all. He used to work for me at my hardware store before he went to the restaurant. I noticed some money missing from the register a few times, but I didn't think much of it. I didn't want to cause trouble, so I let him go quietly. When I saw him that day in the restaurant, I knew it was him doing the same thing again, but I didn't say anything. Tom felt a chill run through him. You knew he was framing people. Sam nodded, his face filled with guilt. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to bring attention to myself or my business. I thought it wasn't my place to speak up. But now I realize I should have. I should have stopped him before it got to you. Tom sat in stunned silence. He wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to be angry, but another part of him understood the fear that Sam had felt. He had seen firsthand how quickly judgment could spread, how dangerous it could be to speak up. Sam continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Tom. I should have done something. I should have spoken up before things got this far. Tom took a deep breath, the weight of the confession settling over him. You should have, he said softly, but there was no malice in his voice. But I appreciate you telling me now. In the days that followed, word of Sam's confession spread through the town. It was a stark reminder of how easy it was for people to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing, and how that silence could cause harm. The community was forced to confront not only their rush to judgment, but also their reluctance to take responsibility for their actions. For Tom, the revelation brought a strange sense of closure. It didn't erase what had happened, but it helped him understand the complexity of the situation. People weren't always cruel or malicious. They were often just scared. And fear could make people do things they regretted. As the town continued to heal, Tom and Susan's actions became a symbol of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Their courage sparked change, not just in the policies of the town, but in the hearts and minds of its people. This story is a reminder that the truth is rarely simple, and that the courage to question and the courage to stand up for what's right can change everything.